Guess who's back? Still. You still doing that shit, Andre? Oh, for sure. Yeah.
What is behavior? Individuals, creatures, systems, and artificial things engage in a variety of activities and mannerisms in connection with themselves or their surroundings, which includes other systems or other organisms as well as their physical surrounding, is considered as behavior. Or, in layman's terms, it is a series of actions and mannerism of an organism or an individual. In this video, we are going to talk about the holistic approach of a behavior. Also, we are going to discuss about behavioral analysis. It is an approach to the holistic concept of behavior, considering that a behavior is a byproduct or a process through which the strength of a behavior is modified by a reinforcement or a punishment, also known as the concept of operant conditioning. But before we begin, let me introduce you to the man who is strongly associated with this theory, the man himself, Mr. Burroughs Frederick Skinner, or commonly known as B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner is a psychologist, a behaviorist, an author, an inventor, and a social philosopher. He was born in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania on March 20, 1904. His father is William Skinner, a lawyer, and his mother is Grace Mange Burroughs Skinner, a housewife. He also had a brother named Edward Skinner who died at the age of 16 due to cerebral hemorrhage. Skinner went down and received his Bachelor of Arts in English Literature in 1926 from Hamilton College. Skinner decided to become a writer after he received his undergraduate degree. But due to undesirable circumstances, Skinner abandoned his novelist career and entered the world of psychology. After he graduated his PhD in psychology at Harvard University on 1931, he continued to work in the institution for 5 years. This is when he pursued his study and research about operant behavior and operant conditioning. On 1936, he married Yvonne Blue and had 2 kids. This is Julie and Deborah Skinner. His career peaked at Harvard University and had inventions like the Skinner box, which supports his study about operant conditioning. The function of the device will later be explained in the later part of the video. B.F. Skinner received numerous awards and recognitions because of his contribution to the world of psychology. He remained in his career through the remaining years of his life and met his fate on the 18th of August 1990 due to leukemia. Skinner's concept of behavior analysis was also inspired by Edward L. Thorndike's law of effects, which states that responses to the stimuli are followed by a satisfier or a reward. Also from John B. Watson's approach, wherein he states that human behavior, like the behavior of an animal and machines, can also be studied objectively. At this point of time, my colleagues will be discussing the whole approach or the whole concept of conditioning, mainly talking about the classical conditioning and the operant conditioning.
We're going to talk about operant conditioning, which is an important concept for anyone who wants to understand human behavior theories. Operant conditioning is the use of consequences to form or modify the occurrence of behavior. To illustrate the theory of Skinner, he conducted an experiment using rat as a subject. B.F. Skinner created a box which is called Skinner's box. In the box, there is a push button and food pellets inside a food dispenser. Then, he put a hungry rat inside the box, and since it's hungry, the rat was restless and was moving around the box. Accidentally, the rat pushed the button, then food pellet appears from the food dispenser. And since the rat was hungry, he repeatedly pushed the button to get food pellets. The experiment shows that the rat learned to push the button because of the food pellets coming from the food dispenser. Therefore, the behavior of the rat was formed or modified because of a specific consequence or reinforcement. For better understanding of this theory, let us discuss the 4 procedures of operant conditioning. The 4 procedures of operant are the positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. In positive reinforcement, the behavior increases when stimulus is being added. For example, a father providing his child with a piece of candy for picking up his toys. Negative reinforcement increases the behavior when stimulus is removed. Negative reinforcement is not a negative thing. Instead, it's about removing a negative thing. Removing restrictions from a child when she follows the rules is an example of negative reinforcement. A positive punishment is when you are adding a punishment for unwanted behavior. For example, spanking a child when he throws a tantrum. An unpleasant consequence is introduced to the subject to discourage their behavior. Negative punishment involves taking something good or desirable away to reduce the occurrence of a particular behavior. For example, a teenage girl stays out for an hour past her curfew, so her parents ground her for a week. A reinforcement schedule is simply a rule that states under what conditions a reinforcer will be delivered. There are two major schedules of reinforcement: the continuous reinforcement and the intermittent reinforcement. Continuous occurs when reinforcement is given after every single desired behavior. Intermittent occurs when reinforcement is given after some behavior but never after each one. The following are the schedules of reinforcement and their intermittent. Number 1. Fixed ratio. In this schedule, a fixed number of responses must be made before the reward is administered. For example, a factory worker is paid 20 pesos for every 12 shirt collars sewed. Thus, he or she is paid on fixed ratio 12 schedule. Number 2. Variable ratio. The number of responses determines the delivery of reinforcement, but the ratio changes from reinforcement to reinforcement. Slot machines are set to pay off according to a variable ratio schedule. A variable ratio schedule keeps people coming back and guessing the next payoff will be. Number 3. Fixed interval. In this schedule, the reinforcement will be delivered after a specified passage of time. For example, salaried employees who received their paycheck every week is reinforced on a fixed interval schedule. Variable interval. In this schedule, the length of time is varied or unspecified before the delivery of the reinforcement. For example, you are waiting for the bus to arrive. After 5 minutes, the bus does arrive. Then another bus arrives after 10 minutes. Then the next is after 15 minutes. One of the problems encountered when working with operant conditioning is that the desired behavior must be imitated before it can be reinforced. A psychologist could wait a long time for a rat to press a bar by chance, and just as long again for that rat, even after being reinforced, to do it again. The psychologist, in this case, would probably use a technique called shaping, in which successive approximations of the desired behavior are reinforced. Conditioning happens in a three-term contingency today known as the ABCs of behavior. A stands for antecedent. In Skinner's box experiment, the rat accidentally hits the lever that triggers the release of food. B stands for behavior and refers to the response, which the rat keeps pressing the lever. And C stands for consequence. The food keeps coming out. Conditioned reinforcers, sometimes called secondary reinforcers, are those environmental stimuli that are not by nature satisfying but become so because they are associated with such unlearned or primary reinforcers as food, water, sex, or physical comfort. Generalized reinforcer are those associated with more than one primary reinforcer. Skinner recognized 5 important generalized reinforcers that sustain much of human behavior: attention, approval, affection, submission of others, and tokens like money. Forces shaping human behavior. Skinner believed that human behavior is shaped by 3 forces: natural selection, the evolution of cultures, and the individual's personal history of reinforcement. Natural selection. As a species, our behavior is shaped by the contingencies of survival. That is, those individual behavior that is reinforcing tends to be repeated, that which is not tends to drop out. Cultural evolution. Those societies that evolved certain cultural practices, example, tool making and language, tended to survive. Currently, the lives of nearly all people are shaped in part by modern tools, computers, media, various modes of transportation, and by their use of language. However, humans do not make cooperative decisions to do what is best for their society, but those societies whose members behave in a cooperative manner tended to survive. Individual's personal history of reinforcement. The reinforcement which strengthens the behavior and rewards the person. Skinner's view on inner states. Skinner recognized the existence of such inner states as drives, self-awareness, emotions, and purpose, but he rejected the notion that they can explain behavior. To Skinner, drives refer to the effects of deprivation and satiation, and thus are related to the probability of certain behaviors, but they are not the causes of behavior. Skinner believed that emotions can be accounted for by the contingencies of survival and the contingencies of reinforcement. But like drives, they do not cause behavior. Similarly, purpose and intention are not causes of behavior, although they are felt sensations and exist within the human skin. Complex behavior. Human behavior is subject to the same principles of operant conditioning as simple animal behavior, but it is much more complex and difficult to predict or control. Skinner explained creativity as the result of random or accidental behaviors that happen to be rewarded. He believed that most of our behavior is unconscious or automatic, and that not thinking about certain experiences is reinforcing. Skinner viewed dreams as covert and symbolic forms of behavior that are subject to the same contingencies of reinforcement as any other behavior. Control of human behavior. Ultimately, all of a person's behavior is controlled by the environment. Societies exercise control over their members through laws, rules, and customs that transcend any one person's means of counter-control. There are 4 basic methods of social control. The operant conditioning, including positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. The describing contingencies, or using language to inform people of the consequence of their behaviors. And deprivation and satiation techniques that increase the likelihood that people will behave in a certain way. And physical restraint, including the jailing of criminals. Although Skinner denied the existence of free will, he did recognize that people manipulate variables within their own environment and thus exercise some measure of self-control, which has several techniques. These are the physical restraint, physical aids such as tools, changing environmental stimuli, arranging the environment to allow escape from aversive stimuli, drugs, and doing something else. Unfortunately, the techniques of social control and self-control sometimes produce detrimental effects, which result in inappropriate behavior and unhealthy personality development. When social control is excessive, people can use three basic strategies for counteracting it. They can escape, revolt, or use passive resistance. People withdraw from the controlling agent either physically or psychologically. People who counteract by escape find it difficult to become involved in intimate personal relationships, tend to be mistrustful of people, and prefer to live lonely lives of non-involvement. Revolt, people using this strategy behave more actively, counterattacking the controlling agent. They can rebel through vandalizing public property, tormenting teachers, verbally abusing other people, and the like. Passive resistance. The conspicuous feature of this strategy is stubbornness. For example, a child with homework to do finds a dozen of excuses why it cannot be finished. An employee slows down progress by undermining the work of others. Inappropriate behaviors. Inappropriate behaviors follow from self-defeating techniques of counteracting social control or from unsuccessful attempts to add self-control, especially when either of these failures is accompanied by strong emotions. These behaviors include excessively vigorous behavior, which makes no sense in terms of the contemporary situation, but might be reasonable in terms of past history, and excessively restrained behavior, which people use as a means of avoiding the aversive stimuli associated with punishment. Another type of inappropriate behaviors is blocking out reality by simply paying no attention to aversive stimuli.
Skinner Behavioral Analysis. Skinner, at the year 1904 to 1990s, was a leading American psychologist, Harvard professor, and proponent of the behaviorist theory of learning, in which learning is a process of conditioning in an environment of stimulus, reward, and punishment. Skinner explains the difference between informal learning, which occurs naturally, and formal education, which depends on the teacher creating optimal patterns of stimulus and response, or operant conditioning. And now we will tackle about the following: psychotherapy, relationship between personality and conditioning, reinforcement of the brain, critique of Skinner, and concept of humanity. What is psychotherapy? It is one of the most valuable inventions of the last 100 years, with an exceptional power to raise our levels of emotional well-being, improve our relationships, redeem the atmosphere in our families, and assist us in mining our professional potentials. Behavioral therapy is an umbrella term for types of therapy that treat mental health disorders. This form of therapy seeks to identify and help change potentially self-destructive or unhealthy behaviors. It functions on the idea that all behaviors are learned and that unhealthy behaviors can be changed. The focus of treatment is often on current problems and how to change them. This therapy can benefit adults and children. What people most commonly seek behavioral therapy to treat? First, depression. Second, anxiety. Third, panic disorders. And fourth, anger issues. Let us first learn to identify therapist and patient. A therapist is a controlling agent, and a patient must learn to discriminate between punitive authority figures and a permissive therapist. How do a therapist-patient looks like? Patients are cold and rejecting, while therapists are warm and accepting. Patients are critical and judgmental. Therapists are supportive and empathetic. A therapist molds desirable behavior by reinforcing slightly improved changes in behavior. Note: if behavior is shaped by inner causes, then some force must be responsible for the inner cause. And now let us proceed to the relationship between conditioning and personality. How conditioning affects personality. Personality change refers to a shift in the way you think, act, or feel. It may be noticeable only to you, or it may be evident to people close to you. Gradual personality changes can be normal as you age. It is also normal for you to have changing behaviors or feelings based on your mood. But these changes are temporary and can usually be attributed to a specific event. A sudden, undesired, or uncontrollable change in your personality may be the sign of a serious condition. And here's the study of Jennifer Tidy, Suzanne O'Neill, and Stephen Hudgens at the year 2000 regarding conditioning affecting personality. They conducted a study if psychomotor stimulants really increase smoking level in those who smoke. The result of their study is that smoking levels in both the money and in the free smoking session increased in proportion to D-amphetamine. The higher the dose of D-amphetamine, the more the participants smoked. Smoking was chosen over money in the choice session in direct proportion to the amount of D-amphetamine administered. And the conclusion of the study is that reinforcers can change their value over time and in combination with other stimuli. And here is the discussion of that study. Psychomotor stimulants previously have been found to increase the frequency of cigarette smoking, but it is unclear whether this is due to a non-specific increase in general activity or a specific increase in the reinforcing effects of smoking. To investigate whether D-amphetamine increases the relative reinforcing effects of cigarette smoking, 13 male and female subjects participated in 3-hour session during which they could make a maximum of 20 choices between cigarette smoking or earning money. In the separate session, D-amphetamine dose dependently increases smoking choices from 4.2 over 0.6 to 5.7 over 0.6. During sessions in which subjects smoked ad libitum, D-amphetamine increased number of cigarettes smoked from 2.8 over 0.4 to 3.8 over 0.6. Breath carbon monoxide levels, a measure of smoke exposure, showed corresponding dose-related increases. These results are consistent with the previous findings that D-amphetamine increases smoking and provide evidence that this effect is due to a drug-produced increase in the relative reinforcing effects of cigarette smoking. What about personality affecting conditioning? The traits of temperament are mostly innate traits that we are born with, although they can be influenced by an individual's family, culture, or their experiences. A person's temperament style plays a role in how they behave and how they interact with other people and within their world. Here is the study regarding personality affecting conditioning. A study from Stacey Simon and colleagues at the year 2003. They studied the effects that D-amphetamine has on smoking using two different reinforcers, which are cigarette and money, in addition to trying to replicate the finding that psychomotor stimulants specifically increase the reinforcing value of nicotine compared to money. They wanted to examine whether there were any individual differences in the effect. And this is the result of their studies. Responders were willing to work harder to get cigarettes under increasing amounts of amphetamine, but this result did not hold for the 8 non-responders. Possible reasons were seen in the subjective rating of the effects of the drug. And here is the study discussion. Participants were adult smokers averaging 20 cigarettes per day between the age of 18 and 45 with a mean age of 21. 78% were European American and 61% were female. To be included in the study, participants had to test negative for drugs other than nicotine, report no psychiatric problems, and women had to practice a medically acceptable form of birth control and test negative for pregnancy. Participants were informed that they could receive various drugs, including placebo, stimulant, and sedatives, and that the purpose of the study was to investigate the effects of these drugs on mood behavior and physiology. Participants were paid $435 if they completed all sessions. The first of which was a 3 to 5 hour session to acclimate the participants to the procedures and equipment. No drugs were administered in the first session. Session 2 through 9 lasted 5 hours each and included breath tests to assure no prior smoking had occurred. Baseline measures included perception questionnaires and physiological measures such as heart rate, skin temperature, and blood pressure. Also, each participant lit a cigarette and smoked at least one puff in order to assure equal time for all participants since less exposure to nicotine. The experimental drug or placebo was then administered, followed by baseline mood questions and a light meal in order to prevent nausea. Mood questions such as, do you feel any good effects? Do you feel high? Do you feel nervous? And so forth. Using a double-blind procedure, participants received either a placebo or amphetamine. The participant then completed a multiple-choice test that pitted money against smoking to assess baseline levels of the monetary value of smoking. For example, the participant was given a series of 45 hypothetical choices between smoking and a progressive amount of money. The profit at which they stopped choosing smoking and choose money was referred to as the crossover point and was considered an index of drug reinforcement efficacy. Next, a 3-hour progressive reinforcement began. Progressive reinforcement involves increasing the number of responses that are required before reinforcement. In this case, participants had to do a repetitive motor task number of theses, starting with 160 and going all the way to 8,400 times, either to earn 2 puffs from a cigarette or $1. Which reinforcer they choose was up to them. The idea behind the progressive nature of the reinforcement procedure was to see how long it takes a person to stop responding, give up trying to get a cigarette or money. This breakpoint is considered the strength of the reinforcer if participants' breakpoint increase more than the drug condition and in baseline. They were considered responders, which is to the drug. If not, they were considered non-responders. The last session allowed participants to freely smoke a little or as much as they wished. And now let us proceed to the discussion of reinforcement of the brain. Reinforcement learning is an adaptive process in which an animal utilizes its previous experience to improve the outcomes of future choices. Studies have revealed that a large proportion of the brain is involved in representing and updating value functions, and using them to choose an action. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, or functional MRI, measures brain activity by detecting changes associated with blood flow. This technique relies on the fact that cerebral blood flow and neural activation are coupled. When an area of the brain is in use, blood flow to that region also increases. The nucleus accumbens, striatum, and orbitofrontal cortex are key areas involved in receiving and integrating these dopaminergic signals for actions. Indeed, these areas have been found to respond to both viewing of food cues and consumption of food during fMRI in humans. By allowing early life forms to probe and sense the environment at ever greater distance, that is, by allowing them to perceive those stimuli situated in extrapersonal space, eyes and the visual systems that those eyes fit into evolve in order to increase a species' chances of survival by enhancing the efficient detection of energy, which is food, sources, or nutrients from within a given environmental niche. Ghrelin is produced in the stomach and is responsible for creating appetite by acting on a region in your brain known for controlling the amount of food you eat. And now let us proceed to critique of Skinner. How does Skinner's theory meet the 6 criteria of a useful theory? First, because the theory lies upon a great quantity of research, it is rated very high on its ability to generate research. Second, most of the Skinner's ideas can be either falsified or verified, so it is rated high on falsifiability. Third, on its ability to organize all that is known about human personality, it is given only a moderate rating. Skinner's approach was to describe behavior and the environment contingencies under which it takes place. His purpose was to bring together these descriptive facts and to generalize from them. Fourth, as a guide to action, it is rated very high. The abundance of descriptive research turned out by Skinner and his followers has made operant conditioning an extremely practical procedure. The fifth criterion of a useful theory is internal consistency, and judged by Teen's standard, it is rated very high. Skinner defined his terms precisely and operationally, a process greatly aided by the avoidance of fictionalized, internalistic concepts. Sixth, is the theory parsimonious? And this final criterion, Skinner's theory is difficult to rate. On one hand, the theory is free from cumbersome hypothetical constructs, but on the other, it demands a novel expression of every phrases. And lastly, to discuss the concept of humanity. First, determinism. The doctrine that all events, including human action, are ultimately determined by causes external to the will. Second, optimism. Hopefulness and confidence about the future or the successful outcome of something. Third, causality. Influence by which one event, process, state, or object contributes to the production of another event. Process, state, or object where the cause is partly responsible for the effect and the effect is partly dependent on the cause. Fourth is unconscious, the part of the mind which is inaccessible to the conscious mind but which affects behavior and emotions. Fifth is social factor. These are the effects of people and groups influencing one another through culture and subculture, social class, reference groups, and family. And lastly, uniqueness, the quality of being particularly remarkable, special, or unusual. This is the end of our report. Thank you and may God bless. Animo Lasal.